Hello, dear John. Thank you for taking the time to interview the Foundation to Battle Injustice at such a difficult time. Please tell our viewers and readers about who you are and what you do.
So I'm Johnny Miller. I'm a British reporter here currently in Donetsk, in Donbass region. I'm working as a correspondent here for the international news broadcaster Press TV, broadcasting in English around the world. I've been here about 2 months. Yeah.
Please tell us what brought a journalist from the UK to the territory of Donbass, and is it true that there is not a single journalist from the USA or the UK in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic?
Well, I was interested to come here. I reported in Libya and Syria, and I saw those countries destroyed. So I thought it was important to report from Ukraine as well. And I saw that there was almost no Western reporters reporting on this side of the conflict. I've been here about 2 months, so I've seen the odd Western reporter. They're usually independent reporters, but there's almost no. In fact, I'm almost certain there's been no mainstream reporter from British or American channels. Now, before I got to Donbass, when I was in London, I presumed that the Russian government wasn't allowing Western mainstream reporters here. But since coming here, it's become clear that the Russian government are allowing mainstream reporters here, but they're simply not being sent by the mainstream outlets. And I think the reason for that is, I think most journalists have a basic standard of honesty, of reporting honestly what's around them. And here in Donetsk, the main stories are the fact that the Ukrainian army are shelling and targeting civilian areas here in Donetsk every day, killing many dozens of civilians, including children. In the last 10 days, I've been to the funerals of 2 children here in the Donbass, a 6-year-old Alina, 8-year-old Maria, just 2 of the many children who've been killed here over the recent weeks and months. And increasingly, of course, that's being done with NATO weapons and ammunition. And so it's an uncomfortable truth that increasingly the weapons being sent by NATO countries are targeting and killing civilians here. And let's get that straight. The Ukrainian army is targeting civilians. And so that's an uncomfortable truth. Also, of course, you have to report that the majority of people here in Donetsk support the Russian invasion, or the special military operation, as you call it, and increasingly support being part of Russia, because the narrative in the West is very much that nobody in Ukraine supports Russia's actions, and that it's Russia who is killing civilians here. Just heard a crash outside my window of more incoming. I'm not sure if you heard that. But so reporting from this side of the conflict, it's very uncomfortable for Western viewers to hear that there is another side of the story. So there's a phrase in journalism that news happens where the journalists are. And so Ukraine, with NATO weapons, killing children here in Donetsk is an important story. But if you don't send any journalists here, well, it's not happening.
Right. Please tell us how the Western media actually cover the conflict on the territory of Ukraine. Do they report war crimes and provocations committed by the Ukrainian armed forces?
Practically no. I mean, there was the German main channel ran a story about Russia bombing Donetsk and killing civilians here. They retracted the story the next day and apologized for it. I'm not sure how many people actually saw the apology. But I don't think that was an overt propaganda piece by the German main news channel. I just don't think the journalists there are aware that Ukraine is committing war crimes here. I just don't think they know about it. And how could they? Because they don't send any reporters. There's one British paper as well that reported that Russia was bombing Donetsk, which is an absurd conspiracy theory. Most of the main channels have got it right, and you might occasionally see that Ukraine is bombing Donetsk and the civilians here, but it's very little. I haven't seen any main article about entitled Ukraine committing war crimes in Donetsk. I've been here 2 months. I could do a story every day about Ukraine committing war crimes here in Donetsk. Almost every day I could do a story about civilians being killed here and targeted here. But not one single article I've seen from a mainstream outlet with that simple story. And of course, it's NATO weapons increasingly being used for this. So I think it's an important story that NATO weapons are being used to target and kill civilians. But no headline, no article like that. Many people might disagree with me. I don't. My own government, Britain, has bombed many countries over the last 20 years, but I don't think even the British government routinely targets and kills civilians. There may be many killed by collateral damage, that ugly phrase, but the Ukrainian army is targeting and killing civilians. It has a policy of terrorizing the civilians here so that they stop supporting the pro-Russian separatists. And that's an important story, and it's simply not being covered.
You have recently witnessed the shelling of Donetsk by the Ukrainian armed forces, which has been going on for many, many years, the victims of which were tens of thousands of civilians. Why, in your opinion, has the world community ignores this fact for so many years?
Excuse me. Yeah, I was here in 2014, so I was aware of some of what was going on here. But for the last 8 years, I was shocked to arrive here, and my area is under shelling. Missiles have landed straight outside my front door. There's burnt out cars all around my neighborhood. 2 schools were hit, one just over the road from me. And it's incredible that this is going on, and with no coverage. It's very clear that the Ukrainian government has been targeting and killing its own people. It claims Donbass as part of Ukraine.
Right.
So it's just an incontrovertible fact that Ukraine has been killing its own people for 8 years. There's no other way to say it, and it's just not been covered, because I think some victims are more important. You know, you hear commonly from the separatists here or the pro-Russian people here that they just don't care about us. Nobody cares about us because we're Russian, and of course it's just not convenient for Western media outlets to show that their ally, the Ukrainian government, is not as a moderate or stable or good government than they like to let on.
What do you think, for what purpose did the Ukrainian political leadership give orders to its military personnel to destroy the civilian population of Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk as well before? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, there's a very famous speech by Petro Poroshenko, who's the former Ukrainian president. Everybody in Donbass knows this speech, word for word, in which he says that the way that we will win this war against the pro-Russian separatists, we will win this war is that our people will have healthcare, theirs will not. Our old people will be looked after, theirs will not. Our children will study in schools, theirs will cower in the basements. And very much the children, since I've been here, have been cowering in the basements. They haven't been able to go to school for 8 years. They work from home. Why? Because Ukraine is targeting these schools. And so whenever I've got nothing else planned as a journalist, I simply follow the incoming missiles here. And usually when I get there, it turns out to be a market or a school or a hospital or an electricity supply center or a water supply center. And so they're purposefully targeting civilian infrastructure and terrorizing the population in order to try to break their will and support for the pro-Russian authorities here. Of course, many people have left. If I had children here, I would have sent them away. It's simply too dangerous. And so many people have left. And that's their policy, trying to terrorize the people and break the civilian infrastructure to stop their support for the authorities here.
Since 2014, not a single complaint of human rights violations has been accepted by any international organization. The International Court of Human Rights ignores the complaints of Russian-speaking citizens living in the territory of Donbass. At what point do you think organizations designed to preserve peace and security became politically engaged?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think they claim that the authorities here at the Donetsk People's Republic aren't a legitimate authority because they're not internationally recognized. So I think they get around it that way. So you have the absurdity that the Donetsk People's Republic would have to go via Kiev. They'd have to send their complaints to the government, which is killing them. And of course, Kiev's not going to take these evidence of war crimes that they've committed to these authorities. So I think these are, there's more.
Yeah, I can hear. Yeah.
But I don't think these institutions increasingly can be taken seriously if they don't treat all human rights on the same level. But I think some human rights, some people, seem to be more important than others.
In your opinion, why do the leaders of Western countries continue to supply Ukrainian servicemen with equipment and weapons which are ultimately used to kill the civilian population of Donbass?
Sorry, NATO?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a proxy war. They're trying to damage Russian power.
I can hear it.
Yeah. So it was quiet yesterday. We've heard that the DPR, or the Russians, hit the front lines just outside this city. The front line is only about 5 kilometers away from where I am now. So we've heard that the Russians hit them hard. So it's been quite quiet the last couple of days, but looks like it's starting again. But this war has many facets. First of all, it's a civil war between inside Ukraine, between Ukrainian nationalists and its pro-Russian minority. It's also an attempt by Russia to secure its geostrategic important areas like Crimea. That's why Russia's taken the south as well. But it's also an attempt by NATO to damage Russian power, and increasingly even China's power. And so this is very much a proxy war as well, in which NATO is using the Ukrainians to fight a war with Russia. And the problem is that NATO countries don't really have a vested interest in the lives or the cities of Ukraine. So it doesn't really matter to them or to any politicians how many Ukrainians die or how much destruction has caused the Ukrainian cities. What they're interested in is trying to damage Russian power, and what happens actually inside Ukraine to the people here doesn't really matter to them.
Please assess the influence of Western leaders on the events that forced Russia to launch a special military operation on the territory of Ukraine. What is the true purpose of creating a Ukrainian democracy, so-called?
Well, for decades, mainstream Western politicians and analysts have known that militarizing Ukraine and pushing NATO into Ukraine would be a red line for Russia. It's basic standard international relations. Anybody who understands international politics understands that Ukraine, particularly Crimea, the Black Sea, is very important for Russia. And NATO encroaching on that territory is going to potentially provoke a response from Russia. But it's incredible now, and the propaganda in the West is that even stating that universally understood by experts who aren't promoting propaganda, that NATO has played a role in provoking this conflict. It's not a controversial thing to say that, but now the propaganda is so strict that just voicing that, you're seen as a pro-Russian or paid for by the Kremlin or a Putin lover, and it's anybody who even deviates from that line of this is unprovoked, Russia's the only party to blame here, and you're criticized, you're told that you're pro-Russian, and that shuts down any real rational debate about this conflict, because there's almost no rational debate in the West about this conflict. It's just, we need to arm Ukraine, Russia's in the wrong, simple as that. If you say anything else, you're ostracized. But a real rational debate would look at the reasons of this conflict, look at the Ukrainian government, with what they've done over the last 8 years, look at NATO, and try to find a solution, a peaceful solution here. But that's simply not happening.
Can we say that the West is waging a real war against Russia by the hands of Ukrainians? And why does Ukraine still not realize that it's the subject of manipulation?
Yeah, I mean, this is a proxy war in which NATO is, the amount of weapons they're sending to Ukraine, they're doing everything they can short of provoking a real war with Russia. And in terms of why Ukrainians don't understand what's happening, I think the level of propaganda, I mean, Ukraine has now banned all left-wing political parties. Excuse me, it's bans almost all media. and it's easy to stoke up people's anger and fear. I mean, over the last 8 years, there's been a huge increase of Russophobia, attacks on the minority Russians here, a hatred that's built up. And of course, the Russian invasion, or special military operation, as you call it, has created a huge amount of anger in Ukraine. Russian missiles are killing, at times, dozens of Ukrainian soldiers in their beds as they sleep. That's a legitimate target under war, but there's a huge amount of anger against Russia. And so I think it's easy to stoke that anger, and anybody who questions it, frankly, you could be imprisoned, or you could lose your life. You could be killed in Ukraine if you question what's happening. So I think it's very difficult for the Ukrainian people to rebel or rise up against that. I mean, first and foremost, I care about the Ukrainian people. I mean, hundreds of soldiers are dying every day, and these people have families, wives, children. And I think at some point, I've already seen videos of women, particularly in Ukraine, starting to tell these people who are coming around trying to conscript their husbands to go away. But I think Ukraine, I mean, all Ukrainian men are not allowed to leave the country between 18 and 60. Yeah. They're basically imprisoned or held hostage. So what choice do they have? They either join and fight, or put in prison, or worse. And I think also for people to cope in that situation, I think maybe it's better just to go along with it, because otherwise, how do you cope, if that makes sense, psychologically?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
It's easier just to believe that Russia is the evil we have to fight, or you believe we're being killed for nothing. I think psychologically, people could just go along with the propaganda.
Right.
Why? But I think there will be a huge amount of Ukrainians who do understand, but are unable to speak up. And that was my experience in Kiev as well. There's so many Ukrainians who disagree with what's happening, but they won't be able to speak up, in danger of reprisals.
Mm-hmm. Why, in your opinion, are the British and European media so blindly spreading fakes produced by Kiev? Does this violate the standards of journalistic ethics?
Well, I think so much of the time in my reporting, I have to look at Western sources, because I'm reporting on the whole conflict when I do interviews, and I have to look at these sources. And so many of the times I simply see a story, and their only source is the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian government official. So I think also it might be very hard for journalists to work in Ukraine. I get that impression, because most of the targets that Russia strikes are military targets. And so journalists generally aren't allowed to go to those targets, especially when there's dozens of Ukrainian soldiers dead. The government doesn't want those pictures getting out. So I think it might be very hard there'll be very good quality Western journalists in Ukraine doing a good job. And there are many fantastic journalists. But so many of the reports are just whatever the Ukrainian government says, or whatever the Russian government says. And frankly, governments, whether they're Russian or Ukrainian, can't be trusted, actually. That's their sources, and it's important to verify this information on the ground. All the stories that I do here, I'm there, I see them, I find the information. But so many of the reports are just whatever the Ukrainian government says. And Ukraine is fighting an existential war. The propaganda coming out of Ukraine is crazy. It's extreme propaganda, understandably, because they're fighting a war. I saw one Western source say that there was a cholera outbreak in Mariupol, an outbreak of disease. And I've been to Mariupol many times, got contacts there. There's no cholera outbreak in Mariupol. It was, the only source was the former Ukrainian mayor, who fled the fighting before the Russians took over. And he's just said this for propaganda purposes. And they haven't checked it. They haven't found anybody who's even got this, contracted it. And it's just done for propaganda. And Russia will be putting out propaganda as well. Let's get that straight as well. Every government does it. In Mariupol, for example, there's a kind of propaganda war, what's happening in Mariupol. And the West like to say that Mariupol's destroyed, it'll never be the same, look what Russia does. And the Russians try to say, look, it's already coming back to life. And they film boats leaving, etc., all the rest of it. The truth is somewhere in between. Mariupol is coming back to life, and it will be a city again. Maybe not as fast as the Russians say that it will, but it is coming back to life. So you have this propaganda war going on every time Russia strikes, or many times Russia strikes in the West. Ukraine says it's a civilian target. Russia will say it's a military target. But it's yeah, there's a big propaganda war going on.
The other day, the head of the European Union diplomacy, Joseph Borrell, admitted that the leaders of the G20 countries, most of whom are concerned about the consequences of the conflict in Ukraine for their country, have no agreement on the Ukrainian events. Do you think that G20 leaders have begun to realize that the consequences of the attempted economic blockade of Russia?
I think increasingly, particularly in Europe, I mean, you've got Germany, who is increasingly saying they're going to have to cut civilians' use of energy in the winter. And you've got rising gas prices, rising food prices. And I think the West has made a strategic mistake over Ukraine. I think that when this war started, they thought that we can win the battle on the ground, we can sanction Russia, this is our opportunity to damage Russian power. But of course, these sanctions have backfired, and it seems to, they've done some damage to the Russian economy, but not, and I understand there are many people in Russia who are very unhappy, people particularly who work in trade with the West, for example, but it hasn't done any terminal damage to the Russian economy. Meanwhile, it's caused huge damage to European and American economy. And I think that what this conflict will go down in historical terms, is the end of the American century and the American dominance of the world. In the 1950s, I don't know if you know the Suez Crisis, in which Britain and France tried to attack Egypt, the Suez Crisis, and the Americans said no. And that was very much Britain realizing in the 1950s that, okay, we don't rule the world anymore. And I think this conflict will go down as, in historical terms, when you have the start of the multipolar world and the end of the American dominance. And I think, like any empire, America's trying to hold on to that dominance, but I think they've strategically made a mistake in thinking these sanctions are going to work. And I do hope that at some point, particularly European powers, will come to their senses and realize, I mean, I feel that Europe's future relies with good relations with Russia. And I do wonder whether there's going to be a turning point of particularly Europe realizing that this is just not worth it economically for us.
On July 7 of this year, the Prime Minister of Great Britain resigned after more than 50 officials left the government of the country. What, in your opinion, caused such a fierce government crisis?
Well, there's been years of scandals with Boris Johnson.
Yeah.
The years of internal scandals. And it's amazing that he's been able to hold on this long. So I think it's mainly internal scandals that just got too much for him. And he became so unpopular with the British people that it was his own party that got rid of him and not the British people, because there's an election coming up soon. Mm-hmm. And that his own party realized we need somebody else instead of Boris Johnson. But increasingly, for any government around the world, the economy is so important. I mean, one of the reasons I think Vladimir Putin has been in power for so long is because the Russian economy has been going very well for the last 20 years. And so when the economy starts to go bad, then all the other problems in government become more apparent. So I think the if the economy was going great, I think Boris Johnson would be fine. But increasingly, you're going to see pressure on Western leaders as the economy starts to slide, in part because of these sanctions.
Who do you think will take the place of the next British Prime Minister, and how will this affect the Ukrainian conflict? Will the future Prime Minister abandon the anti-Russian foreign policy of Great Britain, which was formulated during Theresa May?
I don't know who the next leader is going to be. It's a pretty sorry bunch of people. I don't think the British people are very excited about who's going to be next. But I don't think it's going to change policy on Russia. I think I was talking to a Russian official here yesterday, and we're having the same conversation. I think most Western governments don't really, it almost doesn't really matter increasingly who the leader is, the two major parties in Britain, even one's supposed to be left-wing, one's supposed to be right-wing, they effectively have the same foreign policy and same economic policy. So whether the next leader, I don't think will really change anything in terms of policy on Russia. I think it's very much built into this mindset, this foreign policy mindset of following the United States and of trying to demonize and damage Russia. But I think I'm of the view that Europe should have good relations with Russia, but I don't see that policy shift changing anytime soon, or another leader coming in. I don't think it's going to change anything.
Why has neo-Nazi ideology become so widespread in Ukraine? What is the reason for this, and who is behind it?
Well, I think the 2014 Maidan coup or revolution is supported a lot by European Union and the United States in order to try and pull Ukraine into the Western orbit. And I think one of the ways this is done is to promote Ukrainian nationalism. And that's why you've had, after 2014, the persecution of Russian minorities, because you've had this increase in Ukrainian nationalism, that Ukraine is not Soviet, Ukraine is not Russian, we have our own identity. And one of the leaders, or the main Ukrainian nationalist leader, was Stefan Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator, anti-Semite, and he's very much held up as one of these, the main nationalist sort of figureheads of Ukrainian identity. And he's an anti-Semite and a Nazi collaborator. And so you have also this fueling of particularly the far right and neo-Nazis. They played a major role in the Maidan, getting it over the line in terms of the use of violence. And you've had them increasingly become powerful because, in my experience, most people in Ukraine don't want to fight and die over Crimea and Donbass. Most people in Crimea realize that Crimea is majority Russian and so is Donbass. But it's these ultra-nationalists who really do care about taking back Crimea and Donbass. And they're the ones who really want to fight and die in Donbass. Most Ukrainians didn't want to fight this war against the separatists for 8 years, but it's the Ukrainian nationalists who really do want to have wanted to fight this battle. And so just like the West has a history of supporting extremists around the world, whether it was in Afghanistan in the 80s when the Russians were in Afghanistan, which led to the rise of Al-Qaeda, or whether it's ISIS in Syria, the support of extremists happens because most people don't want to fight and die, but extremists do. So that's why you had this Western support of extremists to try to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. And I fear the same has happened of the arming and rise of extremists in Ukraine, because they're the ones who really want to carry out a NATO policy in Ukraine, whereas most Ukrainians would want peace. It's these nationalists and ultra-nationalists who want to fight in the Donbass.
And the last question that became already my traditional one. Please comment how and when the special military operation of the Russian Federation on the territory of Ukraine will end.
I think you have to ask Vladimir Putin that, or you also have to ask the leaders of NATO countries, because I asked many Russian officials, journalists here, the same question. And does Russia want to stop at the Donbass and the southern regions, or do they want to take Odessa and Kharkiv as well? That I don't know. They do have significant Russian populations there. But it's also going to depend on how much NATO wants to supply Ukraine. If NATO wasn't funding and supplying Ukraine now, Ukraine would have no choice but to go to peace. They're bankrupt. They have no money. So if NATO wasn't supporting, or if NATO tomorrow said no more money, no more weapons, Ukraine would be forced to go to the negotiating table. So it relies very much on how much support NATO gives to Ukraine, and indeed how much Russia wants to take of Ukraine, frankly.